You are tuned in to Wearable on Air with Hillary Topper, the only show featuring the most innovative products and prominent leaders in wearable technology.
Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I, as was said in the introduction, done a lot of work on affective computing. That's computing that relates to, arises from, or deliberately influences emotion. And while we were trying to build technology to read facial expressions one day, working with people on the autism spectrum, we learned something surprising. We learned as we were talking with them that it wasn't so much that they were having difficulty understanding other people's emotion, which sometimes they do, but one person on the autism spectrum pulled me aside and said, "Roz, you have it wrong. Understanding other people's emotions or misunderstanding them is not our biggest problem. Our biggest problem is you're not properly understanding our emotions." And I thought, at first I thought, dear, I guess I'm worse at this than I want to be. And indeed, I have room to improve and continue to. But what she was really saying was that all of us are not very good at understanding the emotions of people on the autism spectrum. And in fact, I go further and say we're not as good at understanding emotions, those of others or ourselves, as we could be. We all have a lot of room for improvement. So I realized that we had a lot to learn about what we were missing. And one of the things I did was start to figure out what is it that we're missing? What are we not understanding that people wish we would understand? And the number one thing that I heard back from people was we are experiencing huge amounts of stress, of anxiety, of sensory overload, of problems from the lights or the perfumes or the sounds. And it's almost as if, for those of us who aren't on the autism spectrum, as if you're sick, you have a migraine, and somebody is bouncing a ball right outside your room, and there's overwhelming sounds and smells coming at you. So you do want to retreat from that, and you do need help managing that kind of overload. But often, a person on the autism spectrum, instead of looking distressed like this little boy does, they might just retreat and look kind of non-expressive and kind of disappear into their own little world. So we realized we had sensors that could measure this, and they had mostly been used in laboratories. How many people here are familiar with the old galvanic skin response or electrodermal activity? There's a lot in this audience. Wow, I'd say like about a third. Your hands went up, a quarter to a third. So this is traditionally measured on the palmar surface, and it can also be measured on the sole of the foot, the dogma set in the literature. So we had been doing that in the lab and using this as one of the arousal dimensions of emotion to see how activated you were, which could go up with negative distress, but it could also go up with positive excitement and eustress. Now, we had to get out of the lab, we learned pretty quickly, because the emotions we were eliciting in the lab, while real, were a very small fraction of what happened in real life that we wanted to understand. So we started to build versions that could leave the lab, and I still vividly remember one day when we had built this purple one on the palm, because we believed you could only do this on the palmar surface, and we were measuring the audience responses of people at a large MIT Kresge event, and we watched the audience glow every time there was a new speaker coming on stage, and would glow with greater skin conductance. And they glowed every time there was a live demonstration. And they glowed when there was laughter. And unfortunately, every time there was extended PowerPoint, there was a decaying exponential in the brightness. So we should be a little interactive here today. Then the executive of Swatch came up to me afterwards and he said, "Wow," he said, "that was amazing. Could you do that on the wrist?" And I said, "No, the theory is it only works on the palm and the soles of the feet. That's where there's the highest density of eccrine sweat glands, blah, 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 blah." I gave him the science. And then in good Media Lab try it out fashion, I reconfigured the purple galv activator, is what it's called at that time, slapped it on my wrist to show him that it wouldn't work, and it lit up. And I realized, wait a minute, there is something going on there. And I said, well, it's not supposed to work. But then we started doing a whole lot more experiments, and now we've published, and other people have published, comparisons. And while there is different information on the wrist than on the palm sometimes, by and large you get a significantly interesting signal. And it turns out it's even more interesting than just sweat and autonomic arousal. And I'll say more about that as we go on. Since then, we've commercialized and built, I don't know, more than 20 different versions of these devices. And today, I'm wearing two of them, the Embrace made by Empatica. Full disclosure, I'm not only co-founder, but I purchased shares as an early co-founder and investor. And I also am wearing the E4 made by Empatica that's been out for over a year, collecting clinical quality data by a bunch of researchers for a lot of different kinds of studies. The kinds of data that we get, I'll say just a little bit about this in the E4. I'll say mostly in this talk about the electrodermal activity on top. That's the signal on top that goes up when my skin conductance goes up. Again, that's usually roughly thought of as this autonomic arousal and excitement, but it turns out to be more interesting than that. And then this one also has a 2 LED photoplethysmograph in it that is giving us the, when I hold still, a nice blood volume pulse signal that can also show the dichronic notch. And from that we can extract heart rate, and when you're still, you can get a nice heart rate variability signal that's within 2% error of gold standard ECG systems when you're still. I'll ask the back to play this video, please. This is, you have to actually click on the video. This is an example of the electrodermal activity for a girl on the autism spectrum. Here it's going up as she's getting on the swing. That blue window is a zoom in of the little blue stripe down below. The wide window at the bottom is about 45 minutes of data from her sensory processing therapy. And you can see this is the third peak in several. We can turn off the sound of this, please. And as she starts swinging, we see this nice decaying exponential here. Getting on the swing is a mixture of physical activation, emotional activation, and cognitive load for a person who has difficulty with motor planning. And those can all map to the signal going up. So there is ambiguity. When we see it go up, unless we also get some other information like motion or other context data, we don't know if a peak means this emotional excitement, this cognitive load, or this physical load. So in all of our sensors, we don't just measure this one signal, we measure other information and put it together. There was actually a movie right before this one too that describes the first peak. I'm not sure we can go back to that, but the first biggest peak is where she's having a meltdown. If you could play just a second of that, we can see right when she loses it here in this video is where the data is peaking for the first time. And we see in this peak that she's also been building for quite a while in the skin conductance. So we see that a peak doesn't necessarily mean there's a meltdown, but when there's a meltdown, there's usually a peak. And we see that here. Okay, so we can pause that video, thanks. So this, what a lot of parents have asked us for, and a lot of people in the autism spectrum have asked us for, is some feedback when that signal is climbing, and what activities are helping it decrease. Because if you could get that data, and you could even learn that for yourself, then you could have better emotion regulation. So many people on the spectrum have come to me and said, Roz, the meltdown just seems to come from nowhere. I wish I could have an early warning indicator that my levels are climbing. And again, it's not a perfect meltdown predictor, but a lot of people are alexithymic. We found this particularly true at MIT in the computer science community. When they say they don't get emotion, they really don't feel the changes. Many people do, but many don't. And if you can't feel those changes happening until they get up to here, then that's really a handicap. So we've built Embrace to facilitate giving that biofeedback. When you build a sensor that can leave the lab, you find a lot of surprising things. And one of the surprises that we found was right about middle December one year, one of my undergrad students came to me at the end of the semester, and he said, Professor Picard, could I please borrow one of your sensors? And the sensor back then looked like the sweatband shown in this picture, and it had all the electronics embedded in it, nice and snug and comfy. You could pick out different styles, the NBA one or the little pink fuzzy one. So his brother picks out this Domo one. And he says, my little brother has autism, he can't speak, and I want to understand what's stressing him out. Can I borrow a sensor? And I said, sure. In fact, don't just take one, take two, because back then they often broke with home-built wiring. I said, do you need a soldering iron? He said, no, I have a soldering iron. Great. So I thought he would put one on, and when it broke, he'd put the second one on. But I'm back in my office looking at the data, and there are two streams of data, so he's using the two at the same time. And I'm really glad he didn't follow my instructions, and he put them both on at the same time. Because what I saw has changed the course of our research significantly. The first day's data looked pretty mundane. The second day, pretty normal too. Thought here, for a boy with severe autism, his stress over vacation looks pretty chill. Next day, looked pretty normal. I go to the next day and my jaw drops. One wrist went so high that we've never seen anybody stressed out that much. And at MIT, we have stressed people out every way imaginable. We even heard one paper of the decade for our Boston driver stress experiments, where we followed people around Boston measuring stress. We have seen big stress. Now, the other signal, the other wrist wasn't responding at all. And I'm like, okay, huh? Like, how do you have stress on one side of your body and not the other? The sensors must be broken. It can't be that big, it can't be non-responsive at the same time. But the data were perfectly normal right before and after this event. In fact, there was a very clear sleep signature right after this event, the data. I won't drag you through all my debugging. I'm an electrical engineer, I tried a lot of things, and finally I gave up and did something I've never done before. I called the student at home on vacation. Hi, how's your vacation? How's your little brother? Hey, any idea what happened to him? And I gave him the exact date and time. And he said, I don't know, I'll check the diary. Diary? MIT student keeps a diary? Like holding my breath. And he comes back and he has the exact date and time, and he says, that was right before he had a grand mal seizure. Now, I didn't know anything about seizures, but I knew another student's dad was a brain surgeon over at Children's Hospital, Boston, who did surgery on epilepsy patients. And I screwed up my courage and called him up out of the blue. Hi, Dr. Medson, my name's Rosalind Picard. Hey, is it possible that somebody could have, and I wanted to sound medical at this point, it's the sympathetic nervous system that gives rise to the skin conductance changes. So I said, is it possible somebody could have a huge sympathetic nervous system surge? And I didn't want to tell him on just one side because I was afraid he'd hang up on me. So I said, just a huge sympathetic nervous system surge. In this case, it looked like it was 20 minutes before the seizure. And he said, no, that's probably not possible. But, it's interesting. We've had people who have a autonomic response where their hair stands on end on one arm before a seizure. On one arm? And I told him about the signal being on just one side. Well, he got excited. I showed him the data. We built a whole bunch more sensors. We got IRB safety approval, enrolled 90 families, and what did we see? We saw 100% of the grand mal seizures had a huge sympathetic nervous system surge.